All right, ladies, today we're going to talk about the Arab Spring. And I know you've already read an article on this particular movement, but let's bring down some of the finer points of that as well, and we'll certainly have a chance to talk about your article at some point as well. To give you a little bit of the background, the term Arab Spring, and that'll fill in the first blank for you there, Arab Spring was first used as far back as 2005, and kind of reflected the hope that the U.S. might come in, and certainly they did invade Iraq, and there was a hope that maybe that would encourage the building of more democracies elsewhere in the Middle East and not just in Iraq as well. But specifically in the year 2011, the term Arab Spring becomes associated with these revolts that just started spontaneously springing up in a number of different countries that served to overthrow longtime Arab rulers in your second point there. And just a few of the countries that have been involved in this in one way or another, we're talking about countries like Tunisia, like Egypt, and Libya, and other countries have been touched by this as well, and we'll talk about different ways that countries have been affected by the Arab Spring movement. And again, this is a movement, there have been a lot of dictators for a long time in various Middle Eastern countries who had, ruled with kind of an iron fist and in total control of everything. But as of 2011, a number of these people have been overthrown, and it's possible that others of them could be overthrown as well. And there are plenty of countries still experiencing unrest, meaning that things are still not totally settled down there, and I doubt that they're going to be settled down for quite some time. These protests against repressive governments, ones that sort of hold down individual rights, began in 2011, like I said, and the region remains in a state of upheaval. Things are still pretty crazy in that part of the world. Very quickly, I just want to start talking about Tunisia here, because that's really was the catalyst. That's the place where the Arab Spring really started to take off. And it began, this is kind of a crazy story, and it came up in the article that you read, so you probably have heard this already, when a street vendor, an ordinary person really, in order to protest the conditions there, set himself on fire, obviously ending his own life in a very painful way because he felt it was that important to draw attention to the situation. So a street vendor sets himself on fire, and that erupts into larger anger and violence all over the country. The end result of it was that the president, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, and I'll spell that name out for you. The first name is Zine, and then a lowercase el dash capital A Bidine. Next word, capital, the name Ben, Ben. Last word, capital Ali, Ali. And he's thrown out of office in January of 2011, and that really is the event that sort of got the Arab Spring going. Now, not long after that, things started to happen in Egypt, and Egypt is an interesting scenario because they had this president who was more or less a dictator for a very long time, and his name was President Hosni Mubarak. First name Hosni, last name Mubarak. And what's interesting about Mubarak is that he'd actually been kind of a U.S. ally. You see pictures of him there with both President Bush and with President Obama in the top two pictures on this page. So we'd had a relatively good relationship with him, but people inside the country got tired of some of the way their rights had been restricted, and he is overthrown not long after the Tunisia incident. This specifically is in February of 2011. The revolution in Egypt was mostly peaceful. There were some scary moments and some near riots in the streets, but compared to some other countries, it was relatively peaceful in terms of a relatively low number of deaths. Mubarak, he was an authoritarian leader, and that's your third blank there. Authoritarian, Authoritarian. And you see the definition of that there. That means he demanded blind submission to his government. He didn't really have a say. You had to follow whatever his government said. He ends up going on trial, and he's sentenced to life in prison. That decision's later overturned, and it really may not matter at this point because he's actually in very poor health and is under house arrest, but staying in a hospital while that goes on. So he's not in much health to be ruling at this point anyway. This is significant because it's the first time an Arab ruler had actually been put on trial by his own people. His own people overthrew him and then put him on trial basically for crimes against them. But things didn't necessarily get any better in Egypt. So they have these new elections. They try to go a little more in the democracy direction. They elect this guy named Mohamed Morsi, and you see him pictured on the bottom right there. And but he also ordered some pretty brutal crackdowns on the people when they disobeyed the government. So they booted him out, and he is now being tried basically for murder of his own people as well. The current president is another guy, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, at this point. So we'll see. The story is obviously ongoing in Egypt, and we'll see what happens from this point out. Libya was a particularly crazy scenario. They had a longtime leader named Muammar al-Gaddafi. I'll spell that for you. First name Muammar. The last name lowercase el dash capital Qaddafi. Muammar al-Gaddafi. You see him pictured on the right there, often dressed himself in military attire like that. Did some very, very sick things to intimidate his own people. We'll get into more detail on the types of things that he would do when we talk about the article in class. But people started rebelling against him in his own country as well. Again, part of the Arab Spring here. And the rebels actually ousted him. They push him from power. The United States helped a little bit. The United States and NATO, which is an international organization, supported airstrikes against his regime. They didn't necessarily send any U.S. troops in on the ground, but there were some airstrikes against him as things started to get out of control there. And ultimately, he was injured in one of these strikes and dragged out of a building that had been bombed. And eventually, after they drag him out, they end up stabbing him in some pretty brutal ways, actually. And he ends up dying of those wounds before reaching the hospital. So he is no longer with us. Libya itself now has this provisional sort of temporary government. But again, this is sort of an ongoing story. And, things are changing by the month here. And it remains to be seen what the long-term solution in Libya is going to be. All right, the only thing I'm going to ask you to fill on in this slide is the name of two countries. And the first one I'm going to mention very briefly is Yemen, Y-E-M-E-N. And they were protesting against the government as well there. Their government is very unstable. A lot of crazy things tend to happen there. Not that anybody's necessarily been overthrown at this point, but it's a very unstable government. Now, the one I have a little more to say about in the second blank there is Syria, S-Y-R-I-A. And the guy you see on the right there, his name is Bashar al-Assad. His father was sort of the dictator of Syria, and he eventually ends up taking over, and he's still in power there, although I have something else to say about that in a second. He's used his own army and navy to, that says attach, it should say attack demonstrators, the people who try to protest against his government, very brutal crackdowns. He has used, as it says near the bottom there, even chemical weapons, which are sort of supposed to be forbidden internationally, but he's done some very, very brutal things to very, very innocent people in his country. Even other Middle Eastern dictators sort of have no longer supported him. What's interesting, though, if you ever get the chance to hear him speak, he's very well educated and speaks very softly. And, some of these dictators sometimes in video may come off as sort of crazy lunatics, and it's easy to know he's just crazy. Bashar al-Assad comes off as very calm and very intelligent when you hear him speak, which makes it even a little bit more chilling. President Obama has called for him to step aside, but obviously Assad is not going to do that of his own accord. There was, as you see there, a UN Security Council resolution that was drafted to put sanctions against Syria. We talked about the idea of economic sanctions, but it failed to pass because Russia and China actually have some economic interest in Syria, and they did not want to sanction Syria because it might have indirectly hurt them as well. He's used chemical weapons against his own people. And the United States was threatening military strikes last year, although the game has changed a lot in Syria. They're still in the middle of a civil war of people protesting against Assad, but now add in the fact that Syria, like Iraq, is one of the countries that ISIS has targeted to build their new Islamic state they're going for. Remember, ISIS stands for Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So things have gotten even more complicated because we obviously don't want ISIS in power, and neither does Assad, but we certainly don't trust Assad either. So there's almost three different sides to this battle that's going on in Syria now, and things have gotten very, very complicated. And yet again, that's a story that's going to continue to play itself out in the coming months and probably the coming years as well. One of the other unique situations that I want to mention just very briefly is in Morocco. They've had a very repressive ruler there for a long time as well. Morocco's trying to get out ahead of the Arab Spring, though. They're trying to introduce a few democratic reforms and make things a little better ahead of time so that maybe the Arab Spring does not spread to their area. Because that's the thing about a movement like the Arab Spring. Other rulers start to look at it happening in countries and saying, oh, that could happen here as well. So even though the revolts aren't in your country yet, you're still looking at it with kind of a certain paranoia or wariness about you. The second country in the second blank there is Saudi Arabia, where they've actually tightened censorship of the internet and print media, and they put more police on the streets to snuff out demonstrations. But then things are changing there currently as we speak as well, because they have a new king as of about 2 weeks ago when their king died, and we mentioned that earlier in the unit. To kind of close this out here, when all this started to happen, the United States was actually pretty surprised. They didn't expect this to happen. And while it seems like a good thing on the surface that people are overthrowing brutal rulers, just because you overthrow a bad ruler doesn't mean that things necessarily immediately get better. That's where the problem is. What happens next? Other groups are going to end up fighting for control. Sometimes we get this picture in our head, oh, you get rid of this bad ruler, it'll turn into this beautiful democracy just like we have. But in the Middle East, there's very little tradition of democracy. They want a voice, but there's no structure in place to necessarily make that happen, and there are people willing to be violent still to take control. So that is problematic as well. If Syria falls, either to its own rebels or to ISIS, at one time we saw an opportunity maybe to change it from a hostile country into a more peaceful one, but now you've got ISIS, so it seems unlikely that there's going to be peace in either Syria or Iraq anytime in the near future. And then there's the worries about, as the government continues to change in Egypt, even though Mubarak was a fairly brutal ruler of his own people, we actually had a fairly friendly relationship with him. So Egypt, at the very least, was not a threat to us, and we're hoping that it doesn't become one as they continue to move forward with new leadership as well. I'll certainly answer any questions on this section that you have the next time I see you guys. But hopefully this was helpful to get our discussion of the Arab Spring movement underway.